This isn't a tale of glory or banners, but of distance turned into pressure, of wood and iron learning to argue with the certainty of armor. Some weapons were built to hold danger at bay, others to remind steel that nothing forged is immune to intrusion. Here, protection becomes a threshold rather than a promise. And at that threshold stands the long, piercing spear, a weapon that stretched reach into a measured geometry of intent, its length shaping the field into corridors where force traveled faster than resolve. Its seasoned shaft bore the weight of momentum without trembling, driving forward not to slice but to enter, pushing against plate with the slow, inevitable confidence of something built for a single direction. When formations collided, the first sound wasn't steel ringing, but the muted, heavy thud of wood transferring pressure into metal that suddenly remembered it could bend. Breastplates caved inward in shallow, inward breaths of iron, ribs stiffening beneath the shock as the spear's point pressed past the comfort of distance and into the private space where flesh tried to hide. In ranks, dozens of such points formed not a wall, but a horizon of narrow destinies, each aimed at seams, hinges, shifting lines where armor thinned and hesitation thickened. The long, piercing spear proved that reach was not merely an advantage, but a philosophy, and that once distance became a weapon, armor became a suggestion rather than a safeguard. From that realization, new shapes grew, each sharpening the same ancient idea that protection was only the beginning of the conversation, never its end. From that first assertion of reach came a refinement of purpose, a recognition that intrusion alone was not always enough, that sometimes the spear needed to cling, to hold, to punish armor not by passing through it, but by refusing to let it escape. This instinct gave shape to the spiked spear, a weapon whose head bristled with jagged teeth that did not simply pierce but gripped the surface they struck. It did not glide along the curve of a breastplate or slip off a rounded shoulder. It bit, scraping channels into metal, catching on ridges, locking itself into the armor's architecture with a stubbornness that forced the body behind it to absorb every inch of pressure. Where the long, piercing spear crushed certainty, the spiked spear dismantled mobility. One hit could anchor a man in place, the barbs drawing plate and padding toward the point in a slow drag that stole breath and balance. Soldiers spoke of the way it altered the rhythm of an advance, how a formation that trusted speed suddenly found itself tangled in its own momentum as these serrated tips hooked shields and harnesses, yanking them aside with a violence that felt almost personal. The jagged head served another purpose as well. It left wounds that armor could not tidy or contain, tearing rather than puncturing, widening rather than passing cleanly through, turning the act of pulling free into a second attack. Against plate, it did not need to break through entirely. It needed only to anchor itself long enough for a second spear to arrive, or for a line to collapse around the trapped fighter. In this way, the spiked spear blurred the boundary between offense and restraint, proving that to break armor, one did not always need to shatter it. Sometimes it was enough to force it to stay exactly where it least wished to be, held in place by teeth of iron that turned every movement into resistance. Through this design, the battlefield learned that damage was not the only path to domination. Immobilization, enforced through a head that clung like a verdict, could unravel a formation as surely as any broken plate. As armies adapted to this cruel new geometry, another idea began to surface: that if a weapon could hold, it could also pull, dragging a fighter not just off balance, but out of the shielded embrace of his companions. And from that thought, something more predatory would soon emerge. From the moment the spiked spear taught armies that holding power could matter as much as penetrating force, the logic of the battlefield bent toward an even harsher truth: that a fighter pulled from his line was more vulnerable than a fighter struck head-on. This gave rise to the harpoon spear, a weapon shaped not merely to enter armor, but to claim the body inside it, its hooked head curving backward like a question to which there was only one violent answer. Unlike clean points or serrated teeth, the harpoon's barbed geometry was built to reverse direction, to turn withdrawal into injury, to drag a man out of formation with a tug that felt less like an attack and more like a verdict delivered through iron. When it struck, the point slipped into the narrow margins between plates or into the softened edges of padding, and the hook found its purchase in the hidden layers beneath. The real power came not at the moment of impact, but at the moment after, when the wielder pulled, twisting the line of force backward, drawing the armored soldier off his feet and away from the shielded rhythm of his companions. Armor that once deflected blows now betrayed its wearer, becoming a handle by which he was wrenched sideways into open space. The harpoon spear turned the field into a shifting geometry of gaps. A single pull could open a breach wider than any conventional thrust, unraveling the cohesion of a shield wall as men stumbled to fill the void left by the one dragged out screaming. And once a fighter was isolated, the armor that had once sheltered him became a trap, its weight slowing recovery, its plates catching the ground as he attempted to rise. The hook dug deeper with each movement, ensuring that escape required stillness, something the battlefield never allowed. In this design, the weapon carried a predatory intelligence, its curve embodying the idea that breaking a formation was more decisive than breaking a breastplate. And as these hooked shadows swept through the press of bodies, commanders began to understand a new lesson. That disruption, when shaped into iron and swung with intent, could fracture certainty more thoroughly than any straight thrust. It was from this evolving pursuit of vulnerability, not at the surface of armor, but at the seams of unity, that another, more balanced creation would grow. A spear concerned not with trapping or dragging, but with delivering force through sheer, disciplined structure. As armies adapted to the harpoon spear's predatory pull, there emerged a counter-instinct, a desire not for hooks or barbs or traps, but for something steadier, purer, a weapon that carried its authority not in clever geometry, but in the disciplined marriage of sturdy wood and honest iron. This impulse shaped the battle spear, a tool that abandoned the theatrics of dragging and anchoring in favor of uncompromising structure. Its shaft was built thicker than that of its lighter cousins, the grain aligned and hardened through slow curing until it felt less like timber and more like a spine engineered for impact. The head, forged into a tapered leaf or diamond, did not rely on tricks of angle. It relied on the fundamental truth that a straight, reinforced point driven with purpose could challenge even the most confident armor. In battle lines, the weapon became an extension of discipline itself, transferring the weight of a formation into a unified thrust that struck with a force no single fighter could generate alone. When a shield wall advanced, each spear acted like a spoke in a wheel of pressure, distributing momentum across dozens of arms so evenly that the front rank felt less like individuals and more like one moving edge of intention. Against armor, the battle spear didn't need to tear or hook. It needed only to focus the cohesion behind it. Plate that resisted a lone thrust buckled under the collective push of a tightly trained line, the reinforced point punching into joints, lifting visors, slipping beneath breastplates where the curve thinned toward softer layers. Even when the weapon failed to penetrate outright, the transmitted force rippled through steel and padding alike, rattling teeth, bruising sternums, reminding the wearer that armor was a shield, not a sanctuary. The battle spear carried a quiet authority on the field. It did not snatch, it did not cling, It did not twist its victims into helplessness. Instead, it asserted space. It carved channels through dense fighting, held lines steady against cavalry surges, and transmitted the will of commanders with a clarity no shouted order could match. And yet, for all its structural power, it sparked a new curiosity among those who studied its limits. If strength and unity could bend armor, then what might precision accomplish? What if the spear could be reshaped not to overpower metal, but to slip through its narrowest breaths of vulnerability with the speed and accuracy of a needle finding its way between ribs? From the disciplined weight of the battle spear grew a fascination with the opposite idea. That brute force was not the only way to challenge armor, that sometimes the surest path into protected spaces lay not in overwhelming pressure, but in stripping the weapon down until only precision remained. This impulse shaped the skeleton pike, a spear reduced to its essential bones, its shaft thinned of excess mass, its head narrowed into a refined point, honed for a single, focused intention. Lightness became its strength. It moved faster than its heavier predecessors, slipping through the press of bodies with a restless, needling hunger, finding the invisible lines where armor plates whispered against one another. The skeletal construction allowed fighters to redirect the weapon mid-thrust, adjusting angles in the small, trembling windows where joints shifted and seams opened for the length of a heartbeat. When it struck, it did so with a concentrated sharpness that felt less like impact and more like insertion, the force channeled through a point so fine that even solid plate sometimes gave way under its insistence, bending inward as if surprised by the unexpected accuracy. Against mail, it passed swiftly, the rings parting around the slender head, as though unsure whether they had been attacked at all. In tight formations, the skeleton pike became the weapon of those who understood the anatomy of armor, fighters who read shoulders, elbows, hips, and knees the way scribes read margins, looking not at the metal itself, but at the human movement beneath it. Its reach was deceptive. Though long, it felt weightless in the hand, allowing sudden bursts of speed that unsettled opponents accustomed to the slower rhythm of heavier spears. And yet, this pursuit of precision revealed a new limitation. Not every engagement allowed the luxury of such exacting placement. There were moments when armor needed to be challenged, not with finesse, but through a method more absolute, more unforgiving. A design that did not depend on angles or timing, but on the simple reality that enough pressure applied to the right point could unmake any defense. From this recognition emerged the next evolution, a weapon built not to glide between plates, but to press directly against them and force the truth of their weaknesses into the open. Where the skeleton pike pursued the fleeting breath between plates, another lineage of design turned its attention to a more brutal certainty. That every suit of armor, no matter how polished or cleverly jointed, bore points of structural tension that could be coerced into collapse through direct, unrelenting pressure. This understanding shaped the anti-plate spike, a weapon that abandoned the long, sweeping motions of traditional spears and instead concentrated its purpose into a short, rigid projection forged for concentrated force. Its head was not a blade, but a narrow punch, thick at the base and tapered into a hardened tip that behaved less like a spearhead and more like a chisel exerting intent against metal's quiet flaw lines. When it struck, the impact did not spread. It tunneled, driving energy along a single axis, seeking the precise spots where curvature shifted or where rivets anchored one plate to the next. The spike punished those anchor points mercilessly. A well-placed thrust could shear a rivet, cave in a hinge, or distort a joint so thoroughly that the armor's geometry failed. the plates locking awkwardly as though the suit had suddenly forgotten how to contain the body inside. Even when penetration was impossible, the anti-plate spike achieved its purpose by deforming the structure around it, pushing armor into the wearer with such concentrated violence that bones felt the tremor long before the mind understood what had happened. In close ranks, it served as a weapon of interruption, jamming itself into the cracks of helmets, elbow cops, or cuisses, wrenching mobility away not by tearing, but by sabotaging the mechanical logic that allowed armor to move. Against cavalry, a thrust beneath the breastplate or into the lower edge of a pauldron could lock a rider's torso long enough to unseat him, the armor turning into a stiff, misshapen cage. The weapon's simplicity made it unsettling. It needed no ornament, no flourish, only proximity and the knowledge of where pressure would matter most. But the very intensity of its focus revealed a new limitation. It thrived only in tight spaces, where fighters pressed against one another in the crush of melee. Soldiers soon asked whether a similar clarity of purpose could be extended to a weapon meant not for the heaving tangle of infantry lines, but for the sweeping, accelerating arcs of mounted charges. And out of that question rose a slender, tapered shape built to marry speed with piercing certainty, a design meant to strike before armor had time to brace. From the tight, crushing closeness where the anti-plate spike thrived, warfare widened again into the long, thundering lanes of cavalry, where momentum carried the weight of a charging body faster than any infantryman could brace against. In that open geometry of speed and impact, soldiers sought a weapon that could translate motion into precision, something neither as heavy as a traditional lance, nor as delicate as the skeleton pike. This need shaped the light-piercing lance, a slender, tapered creation built to strike at the exact moment when a horse's stride and a warrior's aim aligned into one accelerating line. Unlike the massive couched lances designed to shatter shields through sheer bulk, this weapon favored a narrow, hardened point that met armor not as a battering ram, but as a needle riding the force of a gallop. Its shaft, reinforced yet surprisingly light, allowed the rider to adjust angle in the heartbeat before contact, searching for the exposed breath beneath a visor, the vulnerable dip beneath a raised arm, the shifting edge of a cuisse as a horse veered. When it struck, the lance did not splinter with theatrical violence. It drove forward in a clean, unforgiving glide, the speed of the mount adding a ruthless sharpness that even well-forged plate struggled to absorb. A hit to a weakened joint could send shock through the entire cuirass, locking a soldier's torso or stealing control of his legs as the force channeled inward with surgical clarity. Against mail, the point slid through effortlessly, and against layered armor, it found the subtle weaknesses created by fatigue, dents, or misaligned rivets. Its true danger lay in how quickly it reset. Light enough to recover after a strike, it allowed a rider to wheel, thrust again, and carve through disordered lines with a rhythm too fast for infantry to track. Where heavier lances offered one decisive charge, this one offered a sequence of threats, each one sharp, brief, and aimed not at breaking formations outright, but at unraveling them through rapid, targeted breaches. Yet this dance of speed and precision revealed another frontier of design: the recognition that a spear need not choose between thrusting and cutting, that armor might be challenged most effectively by a weapon able to switch intentions in an instant. And so, as battlefields shifted and fighters sought versatility without losing lethality, a new shape emerged, one that carried blades on both ends of purpose. As cavalry swept lines open with the light-piercing lance, infantry faced a renewed question: how to answer armor not just with a single kind of threat, but with a weapon that could change its intent the moment the field demanded it. This search for versatility shaped the dual-bladed pole spear, a long haft carrying blades on opposite ends of its purpose, one refined for thrusting, the other broadened for cutting. Where earlier spears demanded commitment to either penetration or impact, this design let a fighter shift between them as fluidly as footsteps on packed earth. The thrusting point, narrow and hardened, slipped toward armor's edges with familiar precision, but the opposite blade offered a slicing weight that could strike across shields, helm rims, or limb plates with a force that exploited the vulnerabilities caused by angle rather than weakness. When the spear moved, it described arcs that confused opponents accustomed to linear attacks. A sudden sweep of the cutting edge could batter aside a shield just long enough for the thrusting point to dart into the exposed gap, the two ends behaving like a single thought expressed in two different languages. Against plate, the cutting blade did not need to shear metal. It needed only to disrupt balance, to crash into the contours where armor resisted lateral force poorly, tilting fighters into compromised stances that opened joints and seams. In tight formations, the dual-bladed pole spear created pockets of disruption with each rotation, its reach allowing a soldier to occupy more space than his body ever could, forcing opponents to guess which end would speak next. And when armor grew too thick for slicing or too rigid for subtle penetration, the weapon's combined momentum allowed the thrust to arrive with a weight magnified by the preceding swing, the shaft flexing just enough to whip the point into softened metal. Its rhythm was circular where other spears were linear, a geometry that unsettled those who faced it. Yet even this evolving blend of cut and thrust illuminated another ancient ambition on the battlefield: the desire to strike with multiple points simultaneously, to overwhelm armor not with finesse or single-vector impact, but with a trident's certainty that at least one path would find its way past resistance. From that old, enduring instinct rose the next weapon, shaped from the logic that when armor blocks one point, it cannot block all three. From the sweeping, circular confidence of the dual-bladed pole spear emerged an older idea renewed with sharper intention: that armor, for all its plates and curves, could rarely answer more than one threat at a time. This understanding shaped the battle trident, a weapon whose 3 points carved possibility into inevitability. Its central tine drove forward with the familiar authority of a spear, but the two flanking prongs tilted ever so slightly outward, creating a spreading geometry that punished hesitation and forced armor to defend along multiple angles at once. A single thrust offered not one line of intrusion, but three, each searching for a different seam, a different weak joint, a different breadth of movement beneath the metal shell. When the trident met a breastplate, the central point often dented or pierced, but the outer prongs scraped violently across the armor's edges, catching on hinges, collar rims, or the subtle ridges where plates overlapped. This lateral pressure could twist a fighter's posture, wrenching his torso sideways even if the main point failed to penetrate, turning the entire suit into an unwilling lever against its wearer. Against mail, the outer tines dragged rings apart, the widening motion shearing links before the central point arrived to exploit the disruption. In formation fighting, the trident acted like a wedge of intent. It slipped between shields, forced them apart, and opened splits that straight spears could only dream of creating. Its reach was not merely length, but breadth, each thrust expanding into a small, controlled collision that destabilized the space around the target. In the crush of melee, this mattered as much as penetration. A fighter knocked off balance by the outward pull of the prongs became vulnerable even if the armor held, his stance collapsing under the twisting force that sought to unravel his alignment. And yet this tri-pointed logic revealed its own boundary. It excelled at breaking structure and disrupting defense, but it lacked the deep, curved cruelty that could combine both piercing and tearing in a single, uninterrupted motion. Warriors soon sought a form that could hook like the harpoon, cut like the dual-bladed spear, and drive forward with the narrow certainty of a pike, all fused into one unforgiving silhouette. From that convergence of needs emerged a weapon shaped not by simplicity, but by the cold, deliberate arc of a curved edge sharpened for both impact and intrusion. So the battlefield turned once more, reaching for a form that did not merely thrust or slice or pull, but curved. Curved inward like a thought unfinished, like a question asked with the edge of iron. The result was the falx pike, a weapon whose long shaft ended in a crescent-shaped head, forged to combine the brutal clarity of a spear with the raking violence of a sickle. Its design spoke of intention layered upon intention. The forward curve allowed it to bite deeply into armor's contours, slipping past flat resistance to catch where no straight edge could reach. When it struck, it did not stop. It followed through, the arc dragging against plate with a scraping hiss that tore where others pierced, peeled where others pressed. The falx pike did not ask armor to yield. It treated armor as something already failing. Against helmets, it ripped at visors, hooking beneath them like a blade trying to lift the face from the man. Against limb plates, it found the backside. The soft, less curved metal armor makers gave less thought to, and worried it open with twists that felt more like cutting through bindings than steel. In skilled hands, it could strike from above and return from below in the same motion, the curvature guiding the blade back into the fight even after the first thrust had passed. On chaotic fields, where formations dissolved and breath shortened, it became a weapon of angles and second chances, of sweeping half-turns that punished anyone who thought distance was a reprieve. And when it met flesh, the wound it left was wide and strange, a crescent gash that armor couldn't read, couldn't close, couldn't forget. Yet even this cruel and clever shape, for all its borrowed strength from ancient tools of harvest and rebellion, was still only one more answer to the same old question: how to speak through iron. In the end, all these weapons were not inventions but continuations, links in a chain of fear and geometry, each built not to dominate armor, but to listen to its breathing, to hear where it failed. And when they listened closely enough, they struck, not with rage or glory, but with the cold, deliberate finality of understanding.